For 30 years, Bill Holloway built furniture with his hands. His son Todd watched. His daughter Linda smiled for photos. And his wife Margaret made the coffee, kept the books in a small back room nobody visited, and never once complained about the way they spoke about her at family dinners. She walked slowly because of her arthritis. Her hands trembled sometimes when she poured her tea. And for 20 years, the family she had devoted her life to called her fragile, not to be cruel, simply because they had decided long ago that she was. Last spring, Todd and his brother-in-law Greg arranged a meeting with the family attorney. They had a buyer, $8.7 million, everything planned, everything ready. They did not ask Margaret. They did not think they needed to. Frank DeLuca had been the Holloway family lawyer for 32 years. He had kept this particular secret for 20 of them. But when Todd slid the sale documents across the table and said his father had built this company with his bare hands, Frank opened the original business license and placed it face up on the table without a word. One name, only one name, the same name it had always been. They called her the weak one. They never looked at the frame on her wall. Quiet title, one name, 20 years. The oak floors of Holloway Fine Furniture had not changed in 46 years. Neither had the smell sawdust and varnish and something older underneath something that belonged to the years when Bill Holloway worked alone in a cold garage on the edge of town with 2 good hands and no plan except to build things that lasted. On the wall of the main office there was a photograph. Bill broad-shouldered and laughing, holding the first oak chair he ever made, 1978, the year before Margaret met him. Beside the photograph, in a simple dark frame, hung the business license issued in 2004. Nobody had looked closely at it in years. It had become part of the wall the way old things do when people stop expecting them to matter. On this particular Monday morning, the back conference room smelled like fresh coffee and ambition. Todd Holloway stood at the head of the table with a spreadsheet open on his laptop and a confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Greg Cross, Linda's husband, vice president at First Regional Bank, the man who had arranged this meeting, was laying out the terms of the Meridian Corporation offer. $8.7 million for the full chain. 3 locations, the name his grandfather had built into something worth buying. "Margaret doesn't need to know the details," Todd said to his sister, keeping his voice low. "She'll only worry. We'll tell her after everything is settled." Linda nodded. She loved her mother the way people love furniture they have grown up around, without attention, without examination. She'll be relieved, honestly. She won't have to think about the business anymore. Greg slid a document across the table. "We'll need her signature on the relinquishment form. Standard procedure. Her monthly allowance will be generous. We'll take care of her." He paused, then said the sentence that would stay in the air longer than he intended. "Besides, she's never said no to anything in her life." The conference room wall was thin. It had always been thin. Bill had meant to replace it with something more substantial back in 2007, but he never got around to it, and after a while nobody thought about it anymore. In the small office on the other side of that wall, Margaret Holloway set down her pen. She had heard everything. She sat with her blue ledger open on the desk in front of her, the same ledger she had maintained since 2004, every transaction recorded in her careful, unhurried handwriting, every vendor contract, every payroll cycle, every tax decision that had kept this company solvent through a recession and a pandemic and the long, slow years after Bill's heart gave out. The ledger that Todd and Linda had always assumed was something minor. Filing, they called it. Paperwork. Nothing important. Margaret looked out the small window at the parking lot. The maple tree Bill planted in 1985 was beginning to turn. The old delivery truck with the faded Holloway logo sat near the loading dock the way it always had. She was not angry. Not yet, and perhaps not in the way Todd would have recognized as anger. What moved through her in that moment was quieter than anger. It was recognition. She had spent 20 years recognizing things and writing them down and saying nothing, and she was very good at it by now. She remembered the first time someone called her fragile. It was 2005, the year after the business license was filed. She had just been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and Bill's sister Joan had come for Sunday dinner and found Margaret struggling with a jar lid at the kitchen counter. Joan had not lowered her voice when she said it. She never did. "Poor Maggie, Bill. I don't know how you manage with such a delicate wife." Bill had laughed that warm, unguarded laugh of his and said, "Maggie has her own kind of strength." Nobody asked what kind. Bill had known. He had known from the beginning, which was why, when the bank refused to issue him the SBA loan in 2004, refused because of a personal bankruptcy in 1992, that he had kept quiet for over a decade. He had come to Margaret with his hat in his hand and a plan he was not entirely proud of. "They won't work with me," he had said, "but they'll work with you. Your credit is clean, Maggie. Mine isn't." She had signed the papers without hesitation, not because she was easy to manage, because she understood what it cost him to ask. A week before the license was filed, Bill had written her a letter by hand. She still kept it in the brown leather folder in her desk drawer, the one held closed with an old rubber band. She could have recited it from memory, but she still unfolded it sometimes just to see his handwriting. "Maggie, darling," the letter began. "I know this isn't how I wanted things to be, but the bank won't work with me. They'll work with you. You have something I don't have, a clean name. I promise as soon as the loan is paid off, I'll transfer everything back into my name, but until then it's yours. All of it. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Love, Bill." The loan had been paid off in 2011. Bill had never transferred anything. She had never reminded him. And after he died 3 years ago, quietly in the bedroom of the house they had shared for 40 years, she had looked at that letter one more time and understood that some promises are made by people who intend to keep them and simply run out of time. She placed the letter back in the folder. She closed the drawer. She returned to her ledger. In the conference room, Todd was saying something about closing timelines. Greg was nodding. Linda was looking at her phone. Margaret picked up her pen. The weak one, she thought, and for the first time in a very long time she almost smiled. They called her the weak one, and she never corrected them. They planned to sell her company, and she did not interrupt. But in the drawer of her desk, beneath 20 years of careful work that nobody had ever thought to examine, was a letter from a man who knew exactly what she was worth, and a truth that 20 years of silence had kept perfectly patiently intact. If stories like this matter to you, stories about quiet people who held all the cards and never needed to show them, this channel was made for you. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. 3 doors down from Holloway Fine Furniture, past the insurance office and the dry cleaner that had changed hands twice, Clara Nguyen's laundromat had occupied the same corner for 31 years. The sign above the door was the original one, faded yellow letters on a white background, one corner peeling back in a way Clara had never gotten around to fixing. Inside it smelled like warm soap and clean cotton and something indefinably safe, the way certain places do when the same person has loved them for a very long time. Margaret pushed open the door at 4:30, the small bell above the frame announcing her the way it always had. Clara looked up from behind the folding counter and knew immediately. 31 years of friendship had given her a fluency in Margaret that required no translation. The way Margaret held her shoulders, the particular steadiness of her walk. Something had happened. "You look different today, Maggie." Margaret settled into the old plastic chair beside the second row of machines, the chair that had been her chair since 1994, the year Bill's first shop had its best quarter, and they had celebrated with takeout Chinese food eaten on that very seat. She set her purse on her knees. "Todd wants to sell the company," she said. "He didn't ask me. He just told me he needs me to sign some papers." Clara set down the shirt she was folding. She filled the electric kettle without being asked. Chamomile, the same as always, the same tea she had made for Margaret on a winter night in 2006 when Bill was in the hospital after his first heart attack. And Margaret had sat in this same chair and told Clara everything, the loan, the license, the name on the papers that was not Bill's. Clara had listened without interrupting, which was not her natural tendency, and at the end she had simply said, "Does he know you know?" And Margaret had said, "He knows." and that had been enough. "Have you told them yet?" Clara asked now, setting the cup in front of her. "About the license?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. I want to see what they plan to do first." "You've been waiting 20 years, Maggie. How much longer are you planning to wait?" "I'm not waiting," Margaret said, with a patience that came from having made this distinction many times before, at least in her own mind. "I'm watching. There's a difference." Clara pulled a chair around to face her and sat. Outside, a pickup truck slowed at the intersection and moved on. The machines turned with their low, even rhythm, the sound that had underscored 31 years of conversation in this room. "Why did you never tell them?" Clara asked. "Even after Bill died. You could have said something at the reading of the will. You could have walked into that conference room any day in the last 3 years and put the license on the table." She said it without accusation, only the directness of someone who had earned the right to ask. "Why didn't you—" Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. Her fingers were stiff today, the cold always settled into the joints before rain, but she held the warmth of the cup and was quiet for a moment. "Bill never told them about 1992, she said finally. "The bankruptcy. He was ashamed of it. He was a man who had built everything himself from nothing and then lost it all in one bad investment. He didn't want his children to know their father had failed." "Not like that." She paused. "I kept that secret for him. It was the last thing I could do for him." Clara was quiet. This was not new information, but it was the kind of thing that bore sitting with even after all these years. "But Bill has been gone 3 years, Maggie, and right now his son is in that conference room planning to sell a company that belongs to you, a company you saved in 2004, a company you have been running the finances of for 20 years while they thought you were just doing paperwork." She said it gently but clearly, the way a good friend does when gentleness and clarity are both required. "That's not loyalty to Bill anymore. That's something else." "I know," Margaret said. She looked out the window at the street. From this angle, if you knew where to look, you could see the edge of the Holloway sign 3 doors down. She had walked this distance every day for 20 years. "But I want them to find out for themselves. I want them to sit in that room with their lawyer and their spreadsheets and their $8.7 million and discover on their own that the woman they didn't think to ask is the only person with the authority to say yes or no." She set her cup down. "I didn't want them to be told. I wanted them to see." Clara looked at her for a long moment. The machines turned. Somewhere in the back, a dryer clicked into a new cycle. "Do you know what surprises me most?" Clara said at last. "Not that you kept the secret. I've always understood that. What surprises me is that you never used it. All these years, you could have used it to demand a seat at the table, to demand to be included, to make them look at you, and you never did." Margaret's smile was small and carried something in it that was not quite sadness and not quite peace, but something that lived between the two. "Because I didn't want them to respect me because of a piece of paper. I wanted them to respect me because of me. And if they couldn't manage that in 44 years," she picked up her cup again, "a piece of paper wasn't going to change anything real." Clara had no answer for that. Some things did not need an answer. Before Margaret stood to leave, Clara took her hand. Both of them had old hands now, spotted and lined and familiar with work. Clara held on for a moment. "When it happens, when they find out I want to be here afterward, not in the room, just here with the tea, and you'll tell me every face, every single one." Margaret pressed her hand in return. "I promise." She walked back along the street in the early evening light, past the insurance office, past the corner where the parking meter had been broken since August. As she passed the conference room window, she saw Todd and Greg still inside, still bent over their papers, still building a future they believed they controlled. Todd glanced up. He saw her. He waved once, a quick, easy wave, the kind you give someone you are not thinking about, and went back to his conversation. One wave. Margaret smiled as she walked on. Not the smile of someone who had been forgotten. The smile of someone who knew exactly what was in the room and had chosen very deliberately not to say so yet. Clara was the only person in the world who knew the full story. She had known since that winter night in 2006 when Bill was in the hospital, and Margaret was afraid the whole thing might come apart. And in 20 years, Clara had not said a word to anyone. But this evening, watching Margaret pass the conference room window while her son waved and turned away, Clara went back to her kettle and set it to boil. She already knew she would need it soon. She put out 2 cups. She found the chamomile. And she waited. The house was quiet in the way that houses become quiet after decades of living not empty, but settled full of the specific silence of rooms that have held a great deal and learned to hold it without noise. Margaret sat in the armchair by the front window, the one Bill had always complained about because the reading lamp threw the wrong kind of light. She had never moved the lamp. She had never moved anything really since he died, not because she was unable to, because she was not yet ready to decide which version of the house she wanted to live in next. The brown leather folder was open on her lap. She had not opened it fully in years. The letter from 2004 she had taken out many times, held it, read it, folded it back, with the careful repetition of someone handling something that matters. But the rest of it she had left undisturbed. Tonight she went through all of it, layer by layer, the way you read a place by the rings inside its wood. The first papers were from 1992. She had read them once before the day Bill brought them home and sat at the kitchen table for a long time without saying anything. The bankruptcy filing, his full name printed at the top in the cold typeface of legal documents. William R. Holloway. The numbers in the liability column were not enormous by any standard except theirs, but they represented everything, every dollar from the sale of the first workshop, every bit of savings from the early years when they had lived on very little and saved what they could. Bill had put it all into a real estate venture with a man he had known since high school. The man had taken the money and left the state. That was all. That was how it ended. He had not told Todd and Linda. They were 10 and 7 years old. There was no version of the story that a 10-year-old could carry without it changing something. So Bill carried it alone, except for Margaret, who had sat beside him at the kitchen table that evening and said, "We will build it back, slowly, together," and meant it without drama the way she meant most things. The next 12 years were in the folder too compressed into receipts and ledger copies and tax returns. You could read the recovery and the numbers if you knew how the slow accumulation, the careful restraint, no vacations and no new cars and nothing that was not necessary, until by 2004 they had 3 small stores and $200,000 saved, and Bill was ready to do the thing he had been building toward for a decade. He wanted to expand. He wanted to borrow against the business, bring the 3 locations under one brand, make something that would last. The bank said no. Margaret remembered the evening he told her. He was sitting on the sofa in the place he always sat, and he was not crying. Bill did not cry. It was simply not something he did, but he was very still in the way that men become still when they are holding something too heavy to set down. "I can't do it, Maggie. They won't lend to me. Everything we built, it's always going to be just a small shop." He said it without self-pity, which somehow made it worse. The 1992 filing is still on my record. No bank will touch a $1.2 million SBA loan with that on the books. Margaret had been quiet for a moment. Then she had stood, walked to the desk in the corner, and come back with a folder of her own. "I checked," she said. "My credit is clean. Nobody will say no to me." Bill looked at her. In 22 years of marriage, he had looked at her thousands of times, but she remembered that particular look because it was different from the others, as if he was seeing her for the first time, or perhaps finally seeing something he had always known was there but never examined directly. "You would do that, put your name on the loan." "I will do whatever this family needs, Bill. You know that." And so they had gone to the bank together. Bill had sat very still while Margaret signed her name on every page of the SBA application. Margaret A. Holloway. The $1.2 million loan, and because the SBA required that the business owner be the loan applicant, the original business license of Holloway Fine Furniture carried her name as well. Only hers. It had always only been hers. Bill had promised to transfer ownership back once the loan was paid. The loan was paid in full in 2011. He had never transferred anything. Margaret had watched that year come and go without saying a word. She had watched several years come and go. She understood that Bill was ashamed of needing to explain to a lawyer why his own name was not on the paperwork from the beginning. She understood that some things are harder to correct than they are to carry, and she had carried it with him in silence, which was the particular language of their marriage. She was near the bottom of the folder now. She had seen all of it before. Then she turned the last page. Behind the 2004 letter tucked flat against the back of the folder was a second sheet. Cream paper, Bill's handwriting, no date. She did not understand at first what she was looking at. She had opened this folder hundreds of times and never found this page. Had it always been there hidden in the fold? Had Bill placed it there near the end, knowing she would eventually read everything? She read it. Maggie. If you are reading this, I am probably not around anymore. I never transferred my name onto the license. I know I promised. But every time I started to do it, I thought, why you are the one who saved it? You are the one who believed in it when nobody else did, including me. So I left it. If you want to sign it over to the kids, that is your right. If you want to keep it, that is your right too. This is not a gift from me, Maggie. This is something you earned. Love, Bill. Margaret's hands were trembling, not from the arthritis. She read it again. Then she looked up at the photograph on the mantelpiece. Bill broad and laughing, holding the first oak chair he ever made, the hands full of calluses, the smile that had walked into every room before the rest of him did. Bill, she said quietly to the photograph, to the room, to the 20 years of silence that had preceded this moment. You left it for me. All this time you left it for me. She had believed for 20 years that it was simply something he had forgotten, an oversight, a promise that had slipped away in the ordinary business of living and then dying. But it was not forgotten. It was chosen. Bill Holloway, the loudest man in any room he had ever entered, had made the quietest decision of his life and told no one. He had looked at his wife, the woman the whole family called fragile, the woman who signed her name so he could keep his dream, and he had decided without ceremony, without announcement, to leave her everything she had already earned. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret Holloway wept, not for grief, not for loss, but because she understood now that she had been seen, truly seen, by the one person she had most wanted to be seen by. And he had said so in his slow and private way on a piece of cream paper tucked at the back of a folder she almost did not open tonight. In 20 years, Margaret had assumed Bill simply forgot to transfer his name onto the business license. But tonight, 3 years after his death, she found the second letter folded behind the first. And in it, Bill Holloway said the thing he had never managed to say while he was alive. This is something you earned. The loudest man in every room had made the quietest choice of his life. He had seen her, and he had left her proof. Wednesday came with the kind of pale autumn light that made everything look older than it was. Todd arrived at the store at 9:30. He was wearing the charcoal suit he saved for client presentations, and he had the easy, forward-leaning energy of a man who believes the hardest part of something is already behind him. He knocked twice on the frame of Margaret's office door, more announcement than question. "Mom, we should go. The meeting with Frank starts at 10. Margaret was already sitting at her desk, her coat on the brown leather folder in front of her, closed and fastened with its old rubber band. She had been there for an hour. "I know," she said. "I have a few things to bring with me." Todd's eyes went to the folder for less than a second. "Sure," he said. "Whatever you need." He did not ask what was inside. He had not asked in 20 years. This was the kind of detail that Margaret had long since stopped finding painful and had simply begun to note the way she noted everything. Frank DeLuca's conference room occupied the front of his office suite on the second floor of the Larkin building, with windows that looked out over the main street. It was a room that had absorbed a great many difficult conversations over 32 years, and it had the particular stillness of such rooms, the long oak table, the measured light, the quality of quiet that comes not from peace, but from the knowledge that whatever is said here will matter. Todd, Linda, and Greg arranged themselves along one side of the table with the unconscious coordination of people who have rehearsed without rehearsing. Suits folders the brisk efficiency of people who believe they are about to close something. Greg had a legal pad with notes in the margins. Linda had her phone face down, which was her version of paying attention. Margaret sat at the head of the table. She had not planned to sit there. It was simply the chair she reached first. She set the brown folder in front of her and folded her hands over it and waited. Frank came in at 10:02, which was his habit. He set a thick folder on the table, greeted everyone by name, and settled into his chair with the unhurried manner of a man who has seen enough family meetings to know that the one that seems most straightforward is often the one that is not. Greg did not wait. "Frank, we're ready to move forward. Meridian has confirmed the offer at $8.7 million. Todd and Linda will represent the family in the transaction. We just need to confirm the ownership structure and get Margaret's signature on the relinquishment form, and we can send the letter of intent by end of week." Frank nodded slowly. "The ownership structure," he repeated. "Good. Let's start there." He opened his folder. Inside, organized in the careful sequence of a man who had spent 32 years preparing for this particular moment, were the original business license, the articles of incorporation, and every foundational legal document filed in connection with Holloway Fine Furniture since April of 2004. He withdrew the business license and placed it on the table face up, turning it toward Todd. "Before we discuss the sale, I think you should read this." Todd glanced at it the way he glanced at most documents, a quick pass looking for the line that mattered. Then he stopped. He went back to the top. He read it again more slowly this time, and the confidence in his face did something Margaret had never seen it do before. It did not collapse. It simply went still. "Wait," he said. "Why is it—" He looked at Frank. "Why is only my mother's name on this—" Frank's voice was level and carried no particular pleasure. "Because your mother is the sole owner of Holloway Fine Furniture. She has been since the day this license was issued." The silence that followed was not dramatic in the way that silences in films are dramatic. It was quieter than that and heavier, the kind of silence that has weight. Greg recovered first, which was his way. "That can't be right. Bill built this company. Everyone knows that." There was still authority in his voice, but it was the authority of someone reaching for a handhold that is no longer there. "Bill built the furniture," Frank said. "He did not build the legal entity." Linda looked at her mother for the first time since sitting down. "Dad never told us." Frank glanced at Margaret, a question without words. She gave a small nod. He turned back to the table. "Your father filed for personal bankruptcy in 1992. He never disclosed it, not to you, not to anyone outside this room. When he needed a $1.2 million SBA loan to expand the business in 2004, no bank would approve him. His credit history made him ineligible. The only person in this family with the financial standing to secure that loan and therefore to appear as the business owner on all legal filings was your mother." Todd had not moved. He was still looking at the license. Then slowly he turned and looked at Margaret. Not the way he usually looked at her, past her, around her, in the general direction of her. He looked at her directly, and she could see him trying to accommodate something his mind had not made room for. "You knew this," he said. It was not quite a question. "The whole time." Margaret opened the brown leather folder. She had done this so many times in private that her hands knew the sequence without thought, the rubber band, the flap, the careful order of the papers inside. She removed the first letter. Bill's handwriting, 2004, the paper worn soft along its folds. "Your father wrote this a week before he signed the license. He promised he would transfer ownership to his name once things settled." She set the letter on the table in front of Todd, who looked at it, but did not touch it. He never did. Greg had regrouped. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the pivot from surprise to strategy. "But you can transfer it now. That's still possible, isn't it, Frank? She can sign it over to Todd and Linda. We just adjust the timeline slightly." Frank looked at Greg with the expression of a man who has chosen patience over everything else. "Mrs. Holloway can do whatever she wishes. The company is hers, 100%. Then Margaret reached into the folder one more time and removed the second letter, the one she had found 2 nights ago tucked behind the first. She did not read it aloud. She did not pass it around the table. She simply placed it beside the business license where she could see Bill's handwriting while she spoke. She looked at her children. At Todd, who had called her fragile without meaning it as cruelty, which was almost worse. At Linda, who loved her in the absent, incurious way of someone who had never thought to ask what her mother actually did all day. At Greg, who had drawn up a plan to sell her company while calculating his own commission. "I spent 20 years listening to people call me the weak one," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "I spent 20 years in that small office at the back of the store, keeping the books running payroll, filing the taxes, managing every vendor contract this company has ever signed. I never asked for a seat at any table. I never asked for credit. I never asked for anyone to look at that frame on the wall." She glanced at the business license on the table between them. "I want you to understand something. I am not telling you this to punish you. I am telling you because you came into this room today planning to sell something that belongs to me without asking. And before anyone signs anything, you needed to know who you were asking." The room was very still. Todd opened his mouth, closed it. The question forming on his face was one he did not know how to ask. How do you tell your mother you did not know she existed in the truest sense until this moment? Outside, the street went on in its ordinary way. The autumn light moved across the table. Frank DeLuca sat with his hands folded and said nothing because there was nothing yet that required saying. Margaret had waited 20 years for this room. She was in no hurry now. The clock on Frank DeLuca's wall had been ticking through difficult conversations for 32 years. It ticked now through this one, marking each second of the silence that followed Margaret's last words with the same indifference it brought to everything else. The business license lay in the center of the table. Nobody had touched it since Frank set it down. It had the quality of something that had changed the molecular composition of the room simply by being seen. Greg Cross stood up. He was a man who had built his professional life on the assumption that he was always the most prepared person in any room, and what moved across his face now was not just anger, but the particular fury of someone who has discovered the map he has been navigating by was never accurate. "This is absurd," he said. His voice was controlled, but only barely. "You cannot do this. We have been negotiating with Meridian for 3 months. There are people expecting this deal to close." He looked at Frank. "There has to be a legal mechanism, a claim of equitable ownership based on Bill's intent, constructive trust, something." Frank looked at him with the patience of a man who had anticipated this question. Bill's intent, as stated in his own handwriting, was to leave the company to his wife. That letter is dated. It is witnessed by implication of his signature, and the legal record speaks for itself. He paused. "There is no mechanism, Greg. I have been looking at this file for 32 years. Greg turned to Margaret. He had reorganized himself into something that resembled reason, but the calculation behind it was visible to anyone paying attention. "Mrs. Holloway, be practical. You don't know how to run an $8.7 million business." He said it with the gentleness of a man offering rescue. "Selling is the only way to guarantee your financial security. You would have a comfortable income for the rest of your life. Nobody is trying to take anything from you. We are trying to protect you." Margaret looked at him. 20 years of quiet observation had given her a particular quality of attention, still direct, unhurried, that Greg had never encountered from her before, because he had never looked at her long enough to see it. "You call that financial security," she said. "Or do you call it a $300,000 consulting fee deposited into your account before the ink is dry?" Greg went very still. "I know what you were set to earn from this transaction," Margaret said. "I have managed the finances of this company for 20 years. I know what every contract looks like. I know what a finder's fee structure looks like. And I know the difference between someone protecting a widow and someone protecting his commission." Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. It was Linda who broke the silence. She had been sitting very still since Frank placed the license on the table, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something that was not quite grief and not quite accusation, but lived close to both. Mom, you kept this secret for 20 years. You never said a word. She stopped, started again. Did you not trust us? Margaret looked at her daughter, Linda, who had her father's eyes and her father's habit of filling a room without noticing who else was in it. Linda, who had kissed her mother's cheek at every holiday dinner and never once asked her how the books were going. I kept it for your father first, Margaret said. He was ashamed of 1992. He had built his entire identity around being a man who made things with his hands and never asked for help. He could not bear for you to know that when it mattered most, he needed someone else's name on the paperwork. I protected that for him while he was alive. She folded her hands on the folder. After he died, I kept it for a different reason. I wanted to see what you would do when you believed no one was watching, when you thought the only person with any claim on this company was a 67-year-old woman with arthritis who sat in a back room doing paperwork. The room received this quietly. Todd had not spoken since Greg stood up. He was still looking at the license. He had the appearance of a man standing in a house he thought he knew, discovering that the walls are not where he believed they were. I signed every payroll authorization that went through this company. Margaret continued, and her voice remained level, without heat, without victory in it. Every vendor contract, every quarterly tax filing, every insurance renewal. The reason this company has not had a single audit in 20 years is because someone in that back room made sure every number was exactly right. You called it paperwork. She let that word sit for a moment. I ran this company. I ran it while your father accepted the credit because that was the arrangement we chose. And I ran it after he was gone because somebody had to. Todd finally looked up. There was something in his face that she had not seen before, not guilt exactly, but the beginning of it. The first edge of a recognition that has no comfortable place to land. Greg picked up his portfolio and his legal pad. His movements were precise and contained the movements of someone concentrating very hard on not letting what he felt show in his body. He said nothing further. He walked to the door, opened it with a control that just barely held and closed it behind him. The door had barely settled when the sound of his footsteps disappeared down the hall. Frank DeLuca looked at Todd and Linda. I think we have covered what needed to be covered today, he said. I would suggest everyone take some time before any further conversations, and I will be reaching out to Meridian's counsel to let them know the transaction will not be proceeding as discussed. Todd nodded slowly. He seemed to have misplaced the particular confidence he had walked in with and had not yet found anything to replace it. Margaret gathered her folder. She stood slowly with the steadiness of a woman who has known exactly where she stands for 20 years and has simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. She set the strap of her purse over her shoulder. I will be at the store tomorrow morning, she said, looking at Todd and then Linda, and then at neither of them specifically. If you want to come, come. If you want to talk, we can talk. That choice belongs to you. She did not add anything to soften it. She did not need to. But it will be a conversation, not a signing. She walked out of the conference room without looking back. Through the reception area, past the framed real estate certificates on the wall down the stairs, and out into the autumn street where the light was thin and the maple trees were past their peak, and the world was continuing in its ordinary way, indifferent to what had just shifted inside a second-floor conference room on Main Street. Behind her in the room, she had left Todd and Linda sat on opposite sides of a long oak table with a 2004 business license between them. The document was yellowed at the edges and very clear in the center. One name. They had been running for 20 years on land that was never theirs. Every plan, every assumption, every quiet dismissal of the woman in the back room, all of it built on a permission they had never thought to ask for. And now, the permission had a face and a voice, and it had just walked out the door. The store opened at 7:30 the way it always had. Margaret unlocked the front door, turned on the lights in the showroom, and started the coffee in the small kitchen off the back hallway. The radio came on with the lights the same station Bill had tuned it to in 1991, and nobody had ever changed. Soft instrumental music low enough to think over. Outside the street was still quiet. The morning light came through the front windows at a low angle, and moved across the oak floors, the way it did every autumn, turning the grain of the wood a particular color that had no name she knew of. She went to her office and opened the blue ledger. Todd arrived at 9. She heard the front bell and then his footsteps slower than usual, less certain. When he appeared in the doorway of her office, he was not wearing the charcoal suit. He had on a gray pullover and jeans, the kind of clothes he had worn as a teenager when he came in on weekends to sweep the back room and pretend he was helping. He looked younger in them. He also looked smaller in a way that had nothing to do with the clothing. "I don't know what to say," he said. Margaret looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her pen and said, "You don't need to say anything. If you want to understand what this place is, start by coming in." He came in. He stood in the middle of the back room, the workroom that connected her office to the main shop floor, and looked at things he had passed 1,000 times without stopping. The old planer bolted to the work table, the pegboard of hand tools, each one hanging in the same position it had occupied since she could remember. A smell of sawdust and oil and cold metal that had lived in this building for 46 years. He put his hand on the planer, just rested it there. "Dad taught me how to use this," he said. "I was about 9. I made a birdhouse. It was terrible." He was quiet for a moment. "But I never really worked here, did I?" It was not quite a question. "You never had to," Margaret said, not as an accusation, simply as a fact stated the way she stated most things plainly without decoration, leaving it to land where it would. "Your father and I made sure of that. We thought we were giving you something." Todd nodded slowly in the way of someone receiving information they do not yet know how to use. Linda arrived 20 minutes later. She came alone, no portfolio, no phone in her hand. She stood in the showroom for a moment before finding her way to the back. Looking at the display pieces the way someone looks at a room, they realize they have never truly entered, though they have walked through it many times. She stopped in the doorway of her mother's office. Her eyes went to the ledger, then to the shelves of folders along the wall, then to the desk where 20 years of work had been conducted in a space roughly 10 feet square. "Mom," she said. Her voice was different from yesterday. Something had gone out of it that Margaret could not name precisely, the reflexive confidence, perhaps, of someone who has always believed they understand a situation. "All of this. How did you do all of this?" It was not a question about logistics. Margaret stood and gestured to the chair beside the desk, not her own chair. The one visitors sat in an oak armchair slightly worn at the armrest that Bill had made in 1978. The first chair he ever made for sitting rather than selling. Margaret had kept it in her office for 20 years because it was comfortable and because she liked the idea of work, and the beginning of work occupying the same room. Linda sat in it carefully as if she understood without being told that it was something. "Your father was an artist," Margaret said, settling back at her desk. "He could look at a piece of wood and see what was inside it before he ever touched it. That was real. That was not a small thing." She paused. But he could not keep books. He could not hold a vendor to a contract. He could not read a cash flow statement and know 3 months in advance that January was going to be difficult. I did those things. Not because I was told to, because somebody had to, and I was the one who knew how. She opened the ledger to a page from 2009, the year the recession had come for small businesses like a tide that did not care what you had built. The numbers were dense and deliberate, every entry in her careful handwriting. "That year," she said, turning the book so Linda could see, "we almost lost the Oak Street location. I renegotiated the lease, deferred 2 vendor payments with written agreements, and restructured the payroll schedule to get us through February. Your father never knew how close it was. I didn't tell him because there was nothing he could have done, and it would have broken something in him that I did not want broken." Linda looked at the page for a long time without speaking. Todd had come to stand in the doorway. He was reading over his sister's shoulder, and Margaret watched something happen in his face. Not guilt exactly, though guilt was somewhere in it, something more fundamental. The particular vertigo of a person discovering that the ground they have been standing on was built by someone they never looked at directly. "We were going to sell it," Todd said, quietly to no one specifically. "You were," Margaret said, "and you would have let us walk in there and—" He stopped. "I wanted you to find out for yourselves," she said. In that room with the lawyer with your plans on the table. I wanted you to see it without me explaining it, because explanations can be dismissed. What happened in that room cannot be. A silence held for a moment, full of the specific weight of things that cannot be taken back. What do we do now? Todd said. About Meridian. We declined the offer, Margaret said. Frank will send the letter today. And the company. Margaret closed the ledger. She set her hand flat on the cover. The blue cloth worn at the corners, the spine thickened with 20 years of use. We keep working, she said. That is what this place has always done. It works. It does not perform. It does not reposition or rebrand or restructure for investor appeal. It makes furniture that lasts the way your father always meant it to. She looked at her son, then her daughter. If you want to be part of that, I will teach you what I know. All of it. Starting with the ledger. Neither of them spoke immediately. The radio played something gentle and without words. Somewhere in the back of the building, one of the shop workers started up a sander, and the low, familiar sound of it moved through the walls like a pulse. Todd looked at his mother. This woman he had waved at through a conference room window and never stopped to see, and nodded. Once, slowly. Linda looked at the blue ledger and then at the chair she was sitting in and understood without needing to be told something about where she was and what it had taken to make it. For the first time in 20 years, the back office of Holloway Fine Furniture held 3 Holloways. Not a transaction, not a meeting, just work beginning again in the place where it had always belonged. 6 months is not a long time to change the way a family understands itself, but it is long enough to change the way a family works. The showroom on Oak Street had been repainted in October, a warm cream that was close to the original color chosen after Todd spent an afternoon with paint chips and eventually called his mother to ask which one matched the room as he remembered it from childhood. Margaret had told him without hesitation. It was the same color Bill had used in 1989, the year they first moved from the garage to a proper storefront. Todd had looked at her for a moment and then written it down. The renovation had been funded from 6 months of operating revenue, not a bank loan, not an investor, just the steady accumulation of what the business earned by doing what it had always done, making furniture that lasted. Todd was in the workshop when Clara arrived at 2:30. He was at the joinery bench with one of the senior craftsmen working on a mortise joint that was not cooperating. He was wearing a leather apron the same style as the one Bill had worn, which had hung on a peg in the back room for 3 years after Bill died, and which Todd had taken down one morning in November without mentioning it to anyone. His hands had the early calluses of someone who has recently discovered that making things is harder and more satisfying than managing things, and is still deciding what to do with that discovery. He had stopped wearing the charcoal suit to work. He had not stopped wearing it entirely. There were still meetings, still vendors, still the occasional conversation that required a certain formality. But in the building among the wood and the tools and the people who had kept this place running through every quarter Margaret had ever recorded in the blue ledger he wore the apron. It seemed important to him, though he could not have explained it precisely to anyone who asked. Linda was at the front desk on the phone with a customer who had been waiting 6 weeks for a custom dining table. She was not reading from a script. She was talking the way someone talks when they understand what they are selling, the wood species, the joinery method, the reason the lead time was what it was, and why it was worth it. She had spent the first 2 months after the meeting reading everything in her mother's files that she had previously considered too technical to bother with. She had asked questions. Margaret had answered them without impatience and without the particular restraint of someone who has waited too long to be asked. The marketing campaign Linda had launched in November told the story of Holloway Fine Furniture, the way it had actually happened, a craftsman who started in a cold garage in 1978, a woman who kept the books and the company alive through a recession and an expansion and 20 years of quiet work in a small back office. The response from customers had been what Linda had not predicted, and Margaret had not been surprised by. People liked the truth. They came back for it. Clara pushed open the front door at 2:32, carrying the small insulated bag she used for the thermos. Linda waved her through with a smile. Clara had been coming to the store for 31 years and did not require an introduction to anything. She found Margaret in the back office where Margaret always was. The blue ledger was open on the desk, but Margaret was not writing in it. She was looking out the window at the parking lot at the maple Bill had planted in 1985 that had lost most of its leaves now and stood bare and clean against the gray December sky. Clara set 2 cups on the corner of the desk and poured without ceremony. Chamomile, as always. The ritual of it was so well established that it needed no comment. They sat for a moment without speaking, which was one of the things 31 years of friendship permitted. Through the glass panel in the office door, they could see into the showroom. Todd was out from the workshop now, standing with a customer beside one of the dining chairs. He was explaining something about the construction, the joint, the wood, the way it would hold up over time. His hands moved the way his father's hands had moved when Bill talked about furniture with the specific authority of someone who has made the thing he is describing. Clara watched him for a moment. Then she looked at Margaret. "So," she said, "how does it feel?" Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. The arthritis was better this winter than last. She had started a new treatment in September that seemed to be helping, or perhaps she had simply become more patient with it. Either way, her hands held the warmth of the cup without trembling. "You know what I realized," Margaret said, the morning after the meeting with Frank. She paused, watching Todd gesture toward the chair's back legs, the customer nodding. "I had been thinking of it as waiting, 20 years of keeping quiet and waiting for the right moment. But that is not what it was." She looked at Clara. "I was not waiting. I was building. Every entry in that ledger, every contract I negotiated every year, I kept the numbers right. When the numbers did not want to be right, that was not waiting. That was the work. And the work was the point." Clara said nothing for a moment. Then she raised her cup slightly, the way old friends do when no particular words are needed. "Todd asked me last week to look over a proposal he put together," Margaret said, "for new equipment in the workshop. He had built a full cost-benefit analysis, 12 pages. He had calculated the amortization over 7 years. She paused. "It was not perfect, but it was close." She looked down at her own ledger. "He used the same format I use." Through the glass, Todd shook the customer's hand. The customer looked satisfied in the way that people look when they have decided to trust someone. 6 months ago, they had planned to sell everything. Now they were building again from oak and patience, and the slow accumulation of work done honestly, the way it had been done from the beginning in a garage on the edge of town by a man with 2 good hands and a woman beside him who knew how to make everything last. Margaret Holloway sat in her office at the back of the store she had owned for 20 years without anyone knowing it, drank her chamomile tea with her oldest friend, and watched her son explain the difference between good furniture and great furniture to a stranger who had come in looking for a table and was leaving with something more. She had not needed to demand respect. She had simply continued doing the work, and the work had spoken in its own time, in its own language, to everyone who had finally learned to listen. A year is long enough for a business to find its footing. It is long enough for children to begin in small and imperfect ways to become the people they should have been earlier. It is long enough for a woman who spent 2 decades in a back office to stop needing to explain herself to anyone. The showroom on Oak Street had been repainted in October, a warm cream that was close to the original color chosen after Todd spent an afternoon with paint chips and eventually called his mother to ask which one matched the room as he remembered it from childhood. Margaret had told him without hesitation. It was the same color Bill had used in 1989, the year they first moved from the garage to a proper storefront. Todd had looked at her for a moment and then written it down. Frank DeLuca arrived at 10:30 without an appointment the way he had always come when the matter was personal rather than procedural. He set his folder on Margaret's desk and sat in the oak chair across from her Bill's chair, the first one, and folded his hands. "The company is stable," he said. "The last loan obligation cleared in January. You have no outstanding liabilities and a clean operating record going on 14 months. He paused. "I think it's time to make a decision about the license, Margaret. Whatever you decide, I can have the paperwork ready by end of week." Margaret looked at the folder. She did not open it. She did not need to. She had been thinking about this question for a year, in the way she thought about most things quietly, thoroughly, without announcing it to anyone. She looked through the glass panel in her door at the showroom. Todd was at the joinery bench in the back, visible through the open workshop door, working alongside the senior craftsman he had been apprenticing under since January. He was not fast yet. He was careful. There was a difference, and he had learned it. Linda was at the front with a young couple who were choosing fabric for a custom sofa. She was listening more than talking, which was something she had not done a year ago, and her mother had noticed. Margaret turned back to Frank. "Don't change it," she said. "Leave my name on it." Frank nodded once slowly in the way of a man who had expected this answer and was glad to hear it confirmed. Todd had appeared in the doorway. He had caught the last of it, not the full conversation, but enough. He stood for a moment in his leather apron, a pencil tucked behind his ear sawdust on his forearms, and looked at his mother. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her desk. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at the folder and then at her, and then at the folder again. "Mom," he said, "that name on the license, that's yours. It was always yours." He put his hand over hers on the desk, her hand still stiff at the knuckles in cold weather, still the hand that had signed every document this company had ever produced. "Don't change it for us. Don't change it for anyone." Linda had come to stand in the doorway. She had heard enough. She looked at the glass-framed license on the wall, the one that had hung there since 2004, that had been part of the wall for so long that no one had stopped to read it in years, and then she looked at her mother. "Leave it," Linda said. "Let it say what it says. Let everyone who walks into this room know who actually did the work." Frank made a note on his legal pad, a short one. There was not much to record. The decision required no new documents, no transfer of ownership, no signatures from anyone. The license would remain exactly as it had been filed in April of 2004. One name, the right name, the only name that had ever been on it. He closed the folder and stood and said goodbye with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has carried a secret for 20 years and watched it resolve itself in the best possible way. That evening, after the shop closed and the lights in the showroom went down, Margaret stayed for a while in her office. She did this sometimes, not because there was work left, but because she liked the building and its quiet, the way a place settles when the work is done and the day is over, and everything that needs to hold is holding. She looked at the license on the wall. The frame was the same one Bill had chosen in 2004, dark wood, simple, the kind that does not call attention to itself. The glass had a slight cloudiness at one corner from years of light and dust, but the text inside was clear. It had always been clear to anyone who looked. Margaret, a Holloway. She had not needed to fight for it. She had not needed to announce it or argue for it or ask anyone to acknowledge it. She had simply continued to be the person she had always been in the place where she had always worked, doing the work that had always mattered. And the name on the wall had waited patient, specific, entirely accurate for the day when the people who needed to see it were finally ready to look. She turned off the lamp. She picked up her coat and her bag and the blue ledger which she still carried home each evening out of 46 years of habit. She locked the door behind her. The license remained on the wall in the dark, the way it had remained through every quiet year and every loud crisis, holding its one true piece of information in the stillness of a building full of oak and memory and the smell of work honestly done. One name, unshared and unhurried, exactly enough. Thank you for staying with Margaret until the end. If this story touched you, if you have ever felt that your quiet work went unseen, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, the button is right there. More stories about the quiet ones who held everything together are coming. We will see you in the next one.